side journey into the world of manga here, but I think we'll find that. It has to do a lot with alchemy, given the topic. So yes, within the universe of FullMetal Alchemist, what it means to be human is condensed into the following recipe: water, 35 liters, carbon, 20 kilos, ammonia, 4 liters, lime, 1.5 kilos, phosphorus, 800 grams, salt, 250 grams, saltpeter, 100 grams, sulfur, 80 grams, and trace amounts of 15 other elements. These, Edward Elric, the FullMetal Alchemist, tells us are all the elements of the average human body, right down to the proteins in your eyelashes. What makes a human is, according to Ed, strictly biological, determined by the elements that make up our hair, eyes, and even our skin, regardless of our color. This is indicative of Ed's character. Edward is an alchemist, and, as it was in the medieval world, in the world of FullMetal Alchemist, alchemy is a science. One that, through a process of comprehension, deconstruction, and reconstruction, makes transmutation, that is, the altering of matter at will, possible. Alchemists are limited only by the law of equivalent exchange, which dictates that, to create something of equal value must first be sacrificed. Beyond this, the restrictions are few. Turning lead into gold is strictly forbidden, as is, more importantly, the practice of human transmutation. Or, in other words, alchemists might know the recipe for making a person, but actually trying it is off limits. FullMetal Alchemist, the 108-chapter manga written and illustrated by Hiromu Arakawa, began its run in July of 2001 and ran for almost a decade. Its popularity was immense, spawning various companion novels, licensed merchandise, 2 anime adaptations, and an animated film, as well as a live-action adaptation that was picked up by Netflix in 2018. It has been dubbed and subbed into multiple languages, and it has even been suggested that Arakawa's series might be responsible for reviving the flagging English language interest in manga and anime of the early 2000s. The boldness of this claim speaks to the incredible boundary-crossing potential of manga in general, and FullMetal Alchemist in particular. FullMetal Alchemist's success in both Japan and internationally, as well as within circles of dedicated manga enthusiasts and throughout popular culture more largely with casual readers, is remarkable for a number of reasons. The first is that Hiromu Arakawa is a Hokkaido-born woman of half Ainu descent, producing shonen manga, a genre that has historically been marketed to, and that continues to be primarily marketed to, adolescent boys. Another is the centrality of disability to Arakawa's narrative. In particular, her exploration of the disabled subjectivities that do not find resolution in cure. What I discuss in this paper, however, has less to do with issues of gender or ability than it does with the distinctly articulated role of race, space, and place within FullMetal Alchemist. Arakawa's story takes place within an undefinable imagined geography. This is common for manga. Manga stories are often placeless, set in the non-setting of fantasy worlds that can easily be read as vague amalgamations of West and East. And the characters that inhabit them are often similarly raceless, depicted according to visual idioms characteristic of the manga medium. These recognizable stylistic conventions have a generic flavor onto which various possible ethnicities or races might be projected. Integral to the manga reading experience, the streamlined representations that have been developed for the sake of visual pleasure dictate that manga characters' races are, in large part, left to the discretion of the reader. According to an argument put forth by cultural anthropologist John T. Russell, Because in Japan, Western popular culture is not usually raised, Western art, music, cinema, and fashion are not generally described as white. Even skin coloring in manga, in fact, rarely bears racial weight. Instead, the use of halftones, that is, dots or lines varying in either size or spacing, which are drawn together to simulate a tone or gradient, when present on the skin, often indicate emotional state. A common manga convention uses the presence of halftone lines, sometimes extending from the face to cover even clothed parts of the body, are used as markers of embarrassment, shock, or incredulous anger. Studies of manga facial features as sources of humor suggest that we might read this as the half-toned character being quite literally left in the dark, a suggestion that isn't without racial undercurrents. Still, it is this tonal ambiguity that is responsible for questions surrounding the race of manga characters that hover, often unspoken, in contemporary cosplay culture. If manga comes from Japan, are the characters always Japanese? How can the reader tell? If not by looking, is there some other way? And underlying this anxiety is this question: is or is it not appropriate for a non-Asian person to fashion themselves after a maybe Japanese manga character? In FullMetal Alchemist, however, there is no maybe regarding a character's Asianness. Arakawa's imagined geography has been heavily coded to allude to real-world geographies with real-world ethical political implications. And her characters bear distinct visual markers that starkly limit racial possibility. With technology that roughly mirrors that of the early 20th century, Ed and his younger brother Al's home country of Monstrous calls to mind the socio-political geography of interwar Europe. Specifically, Arakawa establishes Monstrous as pre-World War II era Germany, the association made explicit with her designation of the country's leader as Führer King Bradley. According to the same article that posits manga facial features as sources of humor, these features are also our most recognizably human characteristics. This claim initially seems to run counter to Arakawa's portrayal of her Amestrian protagonists. The characters populating Monstrous, Ed and Al included, bear the familiar stylized features of human characters in countless manga illustrations: large eyes, half-circle mouths, and in the black and white scale of manga, skin is left blank, translucent, its color unspecified. If our facial features are what most pointedly indicate our humanity, why would Arakawa choose to equip the characters with whom we are meant to most strongly relate with such ambiguous faces? The answer here lies, I believe, in what requires marking and what is allowed to go unmarked. When it comes to race, as Chu notes in her article discussing the reception of Yellowface at play in FullMetal Alchemist live-action adaptation, in which well-known Japanese actors have been cast, without remark, to play Amestrian characters, the generic bent of Amestrian features is not nonspecific at all. Instead, the absence of racial markers functions itself as a marker. In other words, this lack is not a lack. Like the Western music, television, and fashion that fail to register white as a descriptor, so too are Ed and Al coded as benignly Western. Or, put simply, having been deracialized, they read as nothing, or white. So why is it that we waffle over the possibility that characters from other manga, whose features for all intents and purposes are indistinguishable from Amestrians, might be Japanese? It seems to me that the reason the reader can be sure Ed is not Japanese is the existence of the nation of Qing to the east. A location rarely seen but often alluded to, Qing is home to characters bearing pointedly Asian names: Ling Yao, Lang Fan, Li Mei, and Lieutenant Yoki, each of whom is visually coded as Asian in both dress and appearance. While it is never explicitly stated that Lieutenant Yoki is the same race as these characters who have come to Monstrous directly from Qing, he is similarly visually marked. Yoki sports a sharply triangular mustache rendered into two downward sloping thin black lines, and in times of crisis, his eyes receive the same treatment. The young Li Mei's coating is even more pronounced. Dressed in traditional robes and sandals with her long dark hair pulled up into two buns, she is accompanied in nearly every panel by her pocket-sized panda, Xiao Mei, notably the series' only benign animal companion. The dialogue of FullMetal Alchemist establishes Qing's non-active element of the narrative in the series, a sense of place functioning as essential. The attention to cultural geographic place, even while not in or inhabiting that place, makes an effective method of communicating knowledge of events happening beyond the limits of the panel that nonetheless inform narrative happenings. For example, while Monstrous alchemical practice is framed as a science, the practice of alchemy in Qing, where it is called the purification arts rather than alchemy, is shrouded in mysticism. Presented as cultural rather than intellectual or scientific endeavor, this Eastern alchemy is later revealed to be the wellspring of alchemy in the West as well. The dialogue of FullMetal Alchemist establishes Qing's I already said that. The most important of FullMetal Alchemist's other invented places is Ishbal, which reflects an array of Middle Eastern influences. Arakawa attends to Ishbal's physical environment across a series of amorphic panels, a move that emphatically links Ishbal with the barren desertscape in the mind of the reader. Monstrous is a colonizing force within the geopolitical sphere of FullMetal Alchemist, and shortly before the events of the manga, involved itself in an Ishbalist civil war, which was in fact a large-scale slaughter of the Ishbalan people by the Amazigh army. Racial prejudice against Ishbalans, on whom half-tones do indicate skin tone as the marker of race, remains rampant. I want to stop and note here that I think there are two ways of approaching race within FullMetal Alchemist. The first hinges on what I have so far discussed, the ways in which race relations, and socio-political relationships in the transnational sphere receive explicit treatment in the text. The second is potentially more subversive and requires a multimodal reading beyond even that demanded by manga in general. The act of manga reading is always multimodal, producing a synthesis of picture and text. Cultural geographer Leslie Ann Gallagher speaks of a kind of plate tectonics of word and image that is constantly at play in manga. Because words are themselves part of and assimilated into image panels, she explains, instances of semiotic slippage occur in which we read visual cues and look at letter forms and words as part of an imagistic whole. In this way, comics can be viewed as having their own language. The type of multimodality that I would like to suggest, however, requires the attention to racial anxieties and possibilities that are not made explicit in FullMetal Alchemist, but that I believe undergird Arakawa's narrative. According to the philosophy of horror articulated by Noel Carroll, monsters come in two basic varieties: the fusion or hybrid creature made up of heterogeneous elements, and the fission creature, which, as in the case of the werewolf, is not always what it appears to be. That is, the fission creature is also a composite, but its heterogeneous elements never occupy the body simultaneously. It is the wolf in sheep's clothing, the Jekyll and Hyde, whose identity one can never quite determine by appearance alone. Defined by inscrutability, in either case, the monster is always excessive. Monsters, in Gallagher's word, break the accepted norms of ontological propriety. That is, they defy classification. Monsters populate the panels of FullMetal Alchemist from its first chapter. Indeed, I would argue that monstrosity is one of the narrative's central thematics. Following Carroll's construction of the monsters, FullMetal Alchemist monsters come in two flavors. One is the chimera, which in its Greek mythological construction describes a composite creature. Though the composite parts of the chimera in FullMetal Alchemist differ from those of Greek mythology, its fundamental conceptualization remains the same. Arakawa's chimeras are wretched creatures, the products of bastardized alchemy, and they themselves are bastardizations. Once fully human, the chimera has had its human features merged with those of at least one non-human animal. Within FullMetal Alchemist, the reader's introduction to the figure of the chimera comes through a little girl named Nina, whose father, in a desperate bid to retain his position as an alchemist funded by the military state, has fused her psychophysical form with their family dog. The moment of Ed and Al's realization of what Nina's father has done is played out as one of body horror. "I want to die," Nina moans, her spiky form cast in shadow, her eyes hollowed out points of emptiness. At once monstrous and abject, she is simultaneously an object of pity and disgust come fear, who, upon her own request, is soon put out of her misery. No longer human or animal, Nina's composite form, her ontological failure, has marked her for disposal. Arakawa is not responsible for the introduction of the composite monster outside Greece. Indeed, the Oni figure has long haunted the Japanese imagination. Noriko K. Rader, in her book on demons in Japanese lore, defines the Oni as an alien, a hybrid or earthlings of some different species, or simply a different species on Earth from very long ago. If this seems a broad definition, that is the reason for its appropriateness. The Oni's multivalence is key. It may appear as vaguely humanoid, with skin tones ranging from the natural to the distinctly unnatural. Just as likely is a chance that it will assume the shape of a non-human animal. But whatever its exact origin, the core concept of the Oni lies in its identity as a marginalized being born out of grudge, enmity, and suffering. Given Ryder's description, I want to suggest the Oni is in its construction as a composite marginalized being, and thus Nina and the other chimeras in Arakawa's story all speak to a deeper discomfort surrounding racial mixing and the ontological confusion it causes. The anxiety surrounding the liminal half-breed, stuck between racial worlds, was made explicit in the work of manga illustrator Go Nagai as the popularity of apocalyptic fiction skyrocketed in the 1960s and 70s. Between September 1976 and April 1978, Go Nagai produced Tsutendoji, Devilman, a manga that adapted elements of Japanese folklore for the post-atomic age. In Tsutendoji, the demons for which the series are named are quite literally members of an indigenous race that ruled the earth before the arrival of its current colonizers. It is from this eradicated race that the Devilman draws one half of his semi-human lineage. Tellingly, he is a master of transformation, capable of combining himself with other beings without their knowledge or consent. More recently, Rumiko Takahashi, another notable contemporary female manga illustrator, took up the lineage of the Oni in a spirit similar to Go Nagai in her manga Inuyasha, serialized in Weekly Shonen Sunday. Inuyasha, the name of both the manga and its main character, is translatable as dog demon. Born of a fully human mother and a fully blooded demon father, Inuyasha mourns his heterogeneity. Stronger and more powerful within his yokai state, the protagonist prefers his form. It is not without its drawbacks, however. When his yokai side dominates, Inuyasha trades logic for strength and his restraint for endurance, becoming wild, wanton in the face of his desires. That is, Inuyasha's sense of right and wrong is contingent on his humanity, or Japaneseness, overruling his wild nature, or indigeneity, in what reads not unlike the trope of the hardy and impervious to pain, but ultimately ignorant, if good-natured, indigenous body. Another half-yokai figure that Takahashi appropriates for Inuyasha is the villainous earth spider, also known as the Oni spider. Pictured here, as it appears in Japanese lore, as imagined by the master printmaker Yoshitoshi in his series New Forms of 36 Ghosts. The Oni spider in Inuyasha, named Onigumo, also regrets his half-breed status and is ultimately able to overcome this regret only by allowing his body to be consumed by the full-blooded yokai. Reborn as Naraku, his character undergoes redemption through the final renunciation of Onigumo's influence. Yet the mark of the spider that scars Naraku's back never fades. In something wicked from Japan, Ai Nakao defines the earth spider as one who defies cultural authority, has different customs and manners, and different physiological features from the mainstream body culture. When the earth spider is understood in this way, as the defiant rebuker of cultural authority, Naraku appears physically and indelibly marked by the earth spider's obdurate indigeneity, just as with Yoshitoshi's earth spider at the end of the 19th century. Geopolitics may change, writer argues, attending to the 20-year gulf separating Shutendoji and Inuyasha, but the Oni remains an alienated other. To draw this out further, this othering seems to ring true at least as far back as Yoshitoshi's imagining of the Oni spider. If this is the case, might we not read the chimera of Arakawa's narrative as working within and referencing and drawing from this same tradition of composite monstrosity / indigeneity? What place is there in the world of FullMetal Alchemist for that being that refuses species and perhaps implicitly, like the Oni spider, racial categorization? Is every chimera, like Nina, destined to meet a tragic end? There may be, I think, an answer more hopeful than this to be found in Arakawa's narrative. But before considering it, I want to look at the second of FullMetal Alchemist monsters, the homunculus, which I suggest corresponds to what Carol calls the vision creature. As with the chimera, the homunculus is not Arakawa's creation, in Japan or elsewhere. Indeed, her choice to appropriate the homunculus is fitting. The homunculus has direct ties to actual alchemical practice. 16th century alchemy held that a human fetus grew out of a tiny but fully formed human being. This miniature, not quite yet a human, was given the name homunculus, meaning little man in Latin. Not quite yet a human, I believe, also well describes Arakawa's homunculi. Like chimeras, they are often the product of accident. Attempts at human transmutation result in unintentional homunculi, which is the reason the practice has been barred. The 7 homunculi that act as the primary antagonists of the series, however, are purposeful creations. That is, they are the products of homunculi who have chosen to produce or reproduce other homunculi. Named for their various forms of excess, erotic excess, gluttonous excess, etc., the homunculi who plague Ed and Al are incapable of self-control, entirely subject to their basest and most animal instincts. False humans, the homunculi in FullMetal Alchemist, are dangerous, not least because there is no way of identifying a homunculus via visual cue. They look entirely like an average person because they inhabit entirely average bodies, often appropriating actual human bodies, as in the case of Ling, the boy emperor from Qing, whose body the homunculus Greed uses on and off as his own. Because Ling intermittently comes back to himself with no marked change to his appearance, there's no way of knowing who inhabits the boy's body at any given time. When is Ling really Ling, and when is Ling Greed in Ling's skin? It is this fear that one is not who they appear to be that makes the homunculus so disturbing. That there may be, lurking below the surface, something unfamiliar and terrifying, uncontrollable, and worst of all, unknowable. In her book, Tonal Intelligence, Sunny Chang argues that far from being an empirically observable fact, Race incites suspicion and eludes corroboration. Race, according to Ching, is at once read visually and visually deceiving, a curious mix of depth and surface that denies perfect legibility. So, if race is indeed, as Russell argues, constructed disparately and contingently, using whatever materials are at hand, what happens when the tenuous construction fails? Like the fear of the composite being, the fear of the one who is not who they appear to be has deep roots in Japanese lore, as well as in lore the world over. Possible influences for Arakawa's conceptualization of the homunculus abound. In one tale, for example, Aemon, a man desperate to escape marriage to a wife he no longer desires, murders the unsuspecting woman. In the nights after, he is visited by an enraged ghost who takes his wife's form in the days of her youth, as seen in the work of Ituseo. In a similar tale of visual deception, an ogre assumes the shape of an enemy's aunt in a bid to retrieve his follower's arm after the enemy has severed and hidden it, again illustrated in Yoshitoshi's new form of 36 Ghosts. The deeper anxiety that makes these stories so tenacious, I think, surrounds the failure of visual cues to deliver certainty that someone either is or is not like us. We rely on markers of difference and similarity to establish humanity, that is, social and moral value. To know a being thinks like us and feels like us, that it is capable of being hurt like we are, is to know we should not hurt it. But, as Chu argues, adhering to an essential national or racial identity is a futile effort when one can be convincingly swapped with another. Homunculi are precisely those beings who are not establishable as either human or inhuman, and are thus, throughout most of Arakawa's narrative, seen as a threat to be extinguished, like that of the chimeras.
Are you wrapping up?
Yes. Interestingly, FullMetal Alchemist does not end with the eradication of the homunculi. There is instead a moment of captious surprise, revealed to be space for the homunculi in the new world that Ed Nowell brought into being. The closing chapter of the manga leaves open the possibility for homunculus-human coexistence, if not, perhaps, friendship. While the story Arakawa presents in FullMetal Alchemist makes no promises, there do within it fit what I would call potentialities, and if I'm not overstating, perhaps even hope. In refusing to be classified, monsters may be excessive, but so too might they serve a purpose, both within the narrative of FullMetal Alchemist and more largely as tools more potent than allegory. According to Gallagher, the monster makes its appearance when something is revealed that we are not yet prepared to see. As creatures of the imagination, she argues, they are unexpected and often unwelcome migrants from the virtual. The fact that Arakawa's monsters are unwelcome, however, does not mean they are not necessary. Rather, the kind of hybridity and heterogeneity at play in the construction of FullMetal Alchemist chimeras and homunculi require us to think and scavenge beyond what we are comfortable with and ready for, beyond the exclusively human in our search for potential alliance. That this might, as of yet, not be wholly welcome is not surprising. If to live with and to welcome monsters is to believe in an enlivened world capable of surprise, what surprises await us when we approach Hiromu Arakawa's FullMetal Alchemist as a text that promises not racial resolution, but irresolution. That is, racial alchemy. We may have to explore what we are not quite ready for to find out.